Down there's a lot we get for given on the paper money in our pockets, of many faces and colors to elaborate couple-sided designs. But they were all innovative, how can be tracked behind to the Scotch banks that include modified the person of cash money downward the centuries. Scotland's deposit stretches behind to 1695, while the Banking of Scotland became the other success banking in Europe, following the Banking of England a year over, to question notes. The banking enjoyed a monopolist in banking business polar of the boundary for 21 years. But it was King Banking of Scotland that was to show the more than pioneering following its basis in 1727. It vain no period in producing the at first UK mention to do a major characteristic of a person. The picture belonged to the Tsar at the period, George II. Ruth Kane, Chief of Archive at RBS, explains, no else had very made how up. Notes had published written and several type of style, wavy channel and things. Yet by setting a picture on, it was a really smart go for against forgery since humans are so nice at distinctive diminutive slight differences in many faces. Previous notes were a far cry of the document, or quite, resin, exchange how we aware present. They were connected in books, quite love a contemporary receipt volume, but out of perforations, demand the customer to cut them out in a blade or pair of scissors. Notes of £5 and above were named colloquially as equine blankets since of their huge amount, they measurable at low 9 INX 5 TO. The Board of Scotch Bankers says previous paper money were a key portion of the Exchange of Scotland and competed aggressively in numismatics in the 18th and previous 19th centuries. Down there were times, for sample, while £1 notes were break in halves and room and were recognized as the counterpart of 10 shillings, 50p, or 5 shillings, 25p, in piece. Almost part a age after, Banking of Scotland became one of the at first banks in Europe to question a mention in two colours. The dark blue and dark 1 guinea mention was liberated in 1774. On to Jonathan Callaway, company author in Dave Potato of Document Cash of Scotland, the innovate proven stimulating at the period. He explains, in procedure to make more than rather than one color, you had to etch 2 sheet, one for every of the colors of ink how you were with. Later you had to run the identical chunk of document via 2 print presses in procedure to get the dark and the dark blue toner. It as well had to be properly on the lining up, which they urged the register. How was formally rather hard at how period, that is why down there are so few of these color notes yet about. 3 years after, the King Banking tippet a march on its Scotch, competing by producing the planets at first 3-colored mention. It was etched by Andrew Chime, one of the unique founders of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, and ran of 1777 via to 1792. Down there are some innovative on paper money how can be tracked behind to Scotch banks. In 1822, the Leith Banking manufactured the planets at first memorable question, labeling the trip of George IV to Edinburgh on August 15 of how year as he arriving by ship at Leith Harbour. Mr. Callaway explains, as Leith had its own banking, they felt they had to mark how. In reality, the notes how were created for how event include vignettes show pictures of the harbour in the King Canal boat creature rode in him on it. Down there's as well a vignetting on one of the notes that has him permanent on the embankment enclosed by the hospitable troop and marcher gang. Memorable notes unsuccessful to capture on and comparatively few were initially manufactured by UK banks. Yet, RBS was to restore the experience in the contemporary era by producing a mention in 1992 to mark the Europe Justice Summit Conference detained in Edinburgh how year. If you've always wondered why down there are 2 sides to each banknote, see no future rather than the King Banking for the reply. In 1826, it toothed up a UK at first by creation a style on the behind as so as the front line of a £1 mention. Ruth Kane explains, in comparison with some mention issuers at the period, the Scotch mention issuers didn't include a responsibility mark on the behind. So a lot of British notes had to include a area on the behind for the big responsibility mark. Yet in a various legislative statute for Scotch ones, they were capable to enter the really elaborate carwork style on the behind. How special mention did not recent length, but the concept ultimately trapped on, although uniface notes were yet creature given as deceased as 1969. Mention style was else region in that Scotland play a innovative part. Previous on, Scotch banks employed several of Britain's largest prestigious engravers to make sight-catching notes. They turned on William Household Lizars, a book dealer, editor, and carver of sheet for books. On 1815 ahead, Lizars etched a episode of top-quality notes for Banking of Scotland, Caledonian Banking, the Association Banking, and the West Banking, as lot other. Scotch banks went on to make more elaborate, and nice, notes as period went on. But in spite of abundance of innovate in their overdays, Scotch banks begun to be more than prudent in their attitude. For sample, the King Banking stored more than or less than the identical £1 mention style of 1832 before the medium 1960s. M.S. Kane explains, it modified a bit and it modified form, but you could very recognize it through how time down there were main changes event for against forgery measures during those designs. To the banks it's perhaps been a continuous fight among needing to innovate but as well needing it to see love a appropriate bank note and honor the mores of which slossed up and which human beings are waiting to view. Banks were as well sluggish to end practices such as brush-written signing on every person mention. Mr. Callaway says, down there were a lot of things how were made previous on how were labor intense how became less than feasible the more than notes you were producing. Brush signing is one sample. The recent brush-signed Scotch bank note was the RBS £20 given in 1947. The definitive brush-signed £1 mention was as well given by RBS in 1936, a episode how had require almost 10 millionth signing with 1927. With later, notes include displayed the published sign that we recognize present. The go offered how Scotch finance institutions are yet banking business on innovate while it comes to cash money.